right now I wanted to talk about these two movies about writers in turmoil that literally bring characters to life, but both may also have a lot more to say than just that and kind of go beyond their fantastical concepts. And I do just want to say right up front, I would say for what we're going to talk about and how we're going to talk about it, just so we're all on the same page, I would think you'd have to feel a certain way about, like, art and writing and stuff like that, in order for some of the things we're going to say here to kind of make sense. Otherwise, it's probably going to sound really kind of pretentious and kind of up its own ass. So, hopefully we're on the same page with that. And also, I think what I want to point out right away, talking about the concepts, is what I love about both of these is how both concepts pretty much go completely without explanation, where you just kind of have to run with them. And, like, in Ruby Sparks, they kind of. There's, like, this offhand remark about how, love itself potentially conjured Ruby. But they don't really go beyond that pretty much, and Stranger Than Fiction just kind of avoids that conversation entirely, which makes sense because as far as like just having to run with it, because it's like in Ruby Sparks' sense, we see him sort of conjure her, where she didn't exist at one point and then she suddenly exists, and she didn't have a life prior to this. Whereas the interesting thing about Stranger Than Fiction is that it seems pretty clear that Harold Crick has had an entire existence. Like, he has a job and like everybody knows him, and he has a life that he's set in, despite the fact that we don't hear about any other, like, outlying people. Like, we don't hear much about family or anything like that. We hear a little bit, but not much. And so the concept would be like, so did he always exist when Karen Eiffel started writing him, or was he kind of conjured and his life just sort of came with it? It doesn't matter, honestly. So I like the fact that they didn't really try to go down that path. It's just like, this is what the setup is, and either you're running with it or you aren't. And that's great. And honestly, especially because that opens so many doors, as far as the stories and the emotions that the movies are trying to convey, the more vague, the better in that sense also. It's sort of like a time travel movie, where it's like, you don't really, it's just not necessary. You just got to worry about the story itself and the characters and all that. So I love the fact that neither movie really worries about that and just goes for it as far as what they were setting up. So I would say, and this might be where the pretensions come in, I think I actually want to start with the characters that I feel like I can relate to, who are the writer characters. Paul Dano's character Calvin in Ruby Sparks, and Emma Thompson in Stranger Than Fiction, where both of them are dealing with a sort of writer's block. In Dano's case, in Calvin's case, he's one of those people that will blame his writer's block on pretty much everything else but himself, where it's like, especially the dog in particular, like poor Scotty just really gets the brunt of this. And he's also stuck not just with writer's block in general, but this idea that he wrote this novel that's considered like one of the great American novels, or will be considered one of the great American novels, and he was like he was like 19 at the time, so now he feels like he's kind of cursed, and he has this whole conversation with Steve Coogan, where Coogan says, like, you're better off being mediocre than, like, reaching some sort of greatness, especially reaching greatness early. And just the general idea that people will throw you away if you reach greatness and then you're not consistent. So he's plagued by all of this, but the interesting thing about this that I find very real is that it's actually a very real thing, that just coming up with a character by itself can bring you out of this. And then once you kind of start shaping this character and get yourself involved with this character as you create it, story is kind of secondary for a while, and then the character can ultimately take you to the story and then go from there. And so this idea of him creating a character and then getting emotionally attached to it is something else. Like, maybe not to this extreme, but that is like a very real thing, where you can be writing a character and that's the thing that keeps bringing you back, because it's almost like it becomes a real person that you like spending time with. Like, And like I said, the idea Zoe Kazan had to kind of take that and literally bring it to life is one of the really intriguing things about this concept. Like I wrote almost like it was an almost 200-page script at one point, and it had 6 main characters in it, and I felt like I grew attached to all 6 of these characters to the point that when I finally finished the script, I actually there was like a sadness and depression in me for like the next week following. On top of the fact, which we'll get into with Stranger Than Fiction, 3 of those characters I killed off at some point, and that was like you actually do get attached to characters as you create them in that sense. And so the idea, like to talk about what Emma Thompson's going through here with that aspect also, because apparently she's this sort of obviously on a much higher scale, but apparently she's Nicholas Sparks like, where her mo is killing her main characters, and it's like and it's always trying to find that purpose for if you're going to kill off a character, it has to be for this very profound reason. And the idea that she's also that's where she's stuck, where it's not even necessarily she doesn't have a story or she doesn't have a character or anything like that. It's just reaching a particular point, like knowing where you need to get to, but all this empty space is here on how to make that work and how to make it profound and make sense with everything else. So that's something else that feels very real as far as where these writers in turmoil are coming from. But what I like about this is that it does set up Thompson to be like this sort of cliche basket case sort of writer, where she has, and it's an amazing part for Emma Thompson because she just plays this so well. Where she says stuff like, she read something in a fantastically depressing book, and it's like just that phrase "fantastically depressing" tells you a lot already about this character and how she approaches her thoughts in general. And this great, I love her introductory shot especially, where she's imagining herself like on the edge of a building, basically trying to really be one with death and be around death and thoughts of death in order to take her to this place to where she can finish this story. And she's because the shot starts with Harold looking up and screaming at her disembodied voice, not knowing who she is, and then the transition is her on top of this building looking down, which is a really fantastic transition and a really fantastic introduction. Um, but I also like the fact that it does add these little pieces of humanity in her, where it could have just gone the route of she's just the, like I said, the basket case writer. But given the concept and where it's going and what kind of story she's dealing with and the revelations that she has, I like the fact that she sort of gradually becomes more human to us, mainly through her dialogue with Queen Latifah. Queen Latifah, who feels like kind of an underwritten character, so it is like basically her only purpose is to get this human side out of her, but it still ends up working effectively enough as far as we get like the moments in Stranger Than Fiction that really hit emotionally are sometimes just really small. Like we build up that she like Queen Latifah sees a stack of papers and says like, is this the book or whatever, and she says no, those are my letters, and I never look at my letters, I never read them or respond to them or whatever. And then later on, when she meets Harold and Harold mentions that Dustin Hoffman loves her books, her response is, "I love his letters." And so it's like that there is this humanity in her and this some sort of maybe need for connection in some way, which is something we don't necessarily explore with the character entirely, but even just a little hint of it there makes the story a little stronger given the part that Karen Eiffel plays in this story. Um, but what's interesting about this is you can look at both of these and see, like, from a writer's perspective, these writers do feel very human and have very relatable issues and relatable conflicts. But because we kind of, our emotions mainly fall into Harold Crick and Ruby Sparks, Calvin and Karen Eiffel are almost kind of, in a very broad sense, in a much more nuanced way than this sounds. The writers are essentially kind of the antagonists of the story itself, especially with what Calvin has going on, because, like I was talking about with him literally conjuring Ruby out of not existing at all, like, we don't really know where Harold comes from. But from Ruby going to not existing and nobody knows who she is to existing and being introduced to the real world, but only being able to do so being able to look through it through the eyes of how Calvin has written her, to where he essentially has full control over her. But then he decides to stop writing and just kind of let her be the character, thinking probably nothing will change. And that's where we kind of have to explore a term that I have heard a lot, but I've honestly never really looked into what the actual definition of it is supposed to be. But I can tell you how I've always taken it when I hear this term, which is manic pixie dream girl, which they talk about kind of at great length in Ruby Sparks without actually using the term. Like Chris Messina is describing her and describing how she doesn't really work. Like when she's still on the page, he's describing how she doesn't really work as a person. She's clearly just this character that's this, perfect, perfect but also unlayered version of everything Calvin apparently wants in a woman. So the idea of her coming to life and coming into the real world, it is interesting how they play that up. Where, well, first of all, the definition I think of that I've kind of put on it in the context I've heard the phrase "manic pixie dream girl" is basically some creation of a character, a female character that's obviously really quirky and lovable. It's one of those characters that the audience is kind of supposed to fall in love with, along with the main character, but she has no real basis in reality, and any sort of conflict that she might have or any sort of personality traits she might have are basically there just to be character types rather than to create a real person. So and there's something very one dimensional and surface level about the character. And so where they're made just to be loved by their counterparts or whatever. Or to cause conflict with their quirks or whatever it might be. But like I said, mainly it's somebody just not based in reality. That's the way I always take it when I hear that term, whatever the actual definition is supposed to be. But so to bring a character like that, like Ruby Sparks, out into the real world, it's interesting the way they do that and the way Kazan plays it, because it's also worth noting the directors who did Little Miss Sunshine, Jonathan Dayton and Valerie Ferris, also made this and are a real life couple, as are Paul Dano and Zoe Kazan. So the idea of two real life couples kind of bringing this movie together, it feels like it makes a lot more sense as far as the outlooks. But as far as her being on the page and us seeing her as he's writing when she doesn't exist in the real world yet, and these scenes do seem storybook romantic, and in that context where it's just in a story, it's okay, that's there's something nice about this, and it does feel romantic, it does feel ideal. But then when it's interesting because Kazan's performance doesn't change because the character's literally coming right off the page and into real life, yet somehow, just with the context alone, she seems like she's perfect when he's imagining her, but when she's in the real world, you can immediately tell a difference. She doesn't fit here, basically. And so, and as that goes on, she does seem more like this character that would never exist in this sort of reality until they take it down the path of she does start to think her own way and does get out of his control now that he's no longer writing. But before we continue to go down that path, you could almost say Anna, the Maggie Gyllenhaal character in Stranger Than Fiction, is also flirting with being a sort of manic pixie dream girl. But what's interesting about her is when we do meet her, the reason I say that is when she talks about the reasons that she's just not gonna pay her taxes, or not pay all of them, because there's certain things that she doesn't mind paying taxes for, and others where it's for war benefits or the government in general or whatever, and she's just not going to. And it's and while Harold keeps telling her well, they kind of joke oh, you're gonna go to prison though. It's she just sort of lives in this whole other plane of existence, and that's just the way she goes through life. And then as it goes on, though, I guess much like Ruby, even though Anna's not the fictional character in this movie, weirdly enough, um, she does. It feels like the more she talks to the Herald and the more connection they have, the more we do kind of start to see the real side, where she actually gets to be not just the person that was on the surface or just the person that's not paying her taxes. When we learn like everything about the backstory and her like knowing what her failures were and deciding which direction she was going to take in life for her, like basically looking out for where she would be most happy in life is where she made sure she went, whether it was successful or not. And just in general, the way she doesn't completely behave like a fictional character would. But the interesting thing about this is talking about our other fictional character, the main character of Stranger Than Fiction with Harold. There's a number of great things about this. First of all, the fact that Will Ferrell gets, like, whenever Will Ferrell comes up, and you talk about how maybe not all of his comedies hit, but even whether they do or whether they don't, he's mainly known for being in these really boisterous comedies, playing really sort of loud and frantic characters, and that's just kind of his thing, and often weird characters. But there's always somebody in the crowd saying, everybody should watch Stranger Than Fiction, because it's a totally different thing. He's, like, totally serious. And you'll hear that, and you take that in, and it's like, oh, so, like, you know, other times we've seen, like, Jim Carrey or Robin Williams or whatever, oh, he can do comedy and he can do drama, that's great. But I feel like that kind of downplays, because this is something I'd never really thought about, but I was kind of really looking the last time I watched Stranger Than Fiction, and I honestly think, without being hyperbolic, Will Ferrell's performance in this is kind of perfect. Like, I can't really see a false note in it at all, and that's something that would be hard to do with this character, especially for a character that's like finding himself and having an arc that we've seen so many times before, but he's doing it in such a nuanced way. Where it's like when we see him at the beginning and we get to know his routines and stuff like that, we don't really get much of a vibe of him, because that's kind of the point, is that he just doesn't really have a vibe. He's just existing. But when we see him go through his routines, and he's got, the way he counts everything, and he goes by his watch, and he goes to work, and he knows exactly what he's doing, there's this, I guess you could say, a contentedness in him, where it's like we don't really see, like, you maybe get the sense of loneliness, but like we said, it's really just, it almost looks like, on the surface, a solitary life is what he prefers. But it's like, even, you can still be content in that context, but also want to be a part of something, like, greater and more profound at some point, once you reach a certain point, and it's just the fact that him finally being able to reach a profound moment in his life might be him having to die. So the idea of that crossing over with him meeting Maggie Gyllenhaal and having these scenes of really good chemistry, you may not think of Will Ferrell and Maggie Gyllenhaal right away when you think of great chemistry, but the way it also seems like one of those things where it would seem like a script working, because that's kind of literally what the movie is he's following a story. But even though this is obviously a script at work as a movie, but also it's being written as it goes in the movie itself, there's still somehow something natural between the two of them when they interact. And even though she hated him at first, and Dustin Hoffman even brings up that that's the trope, is, well, if you fall in love with somebody, they're probably going to hate you first, and then they're going to... But even though it's completely and totally at every turn established that as a trope, and something that's like this rule of writing, somehow this relationship still works, I think, for the audience, and they make it believable, and that's something where you can kind of see this eventual theme of sort of breaking out of the confines of story. And so him being able to bring that, and the interesting idea of making Harold, the fact that he works for the IRS, and which obviously just goes with the death and taxes thing, but the fact that they were able to humanize somebody that works for the IRS was, I like the way they kind of took approaches like that too, not just seeing Harold as a character in general, but like the way his interactions with Tony Hale also. or something else that like really brings out this different side of Harold, where he like when he's forced to come out of his solitary life and has to start rooming with Tony Hale. And we get these really like obviously the scenes with Tony Hale are supposed to be kind of like maybe uncomfortable and funny, but there's also something really quietly touching about them also, and they also have a really nice payoff. So the way the characters sort of bring out this environment also are really working. Um, there's the moment where Harold starts to trash his room when he learns that his death is coming, but he doesn't know what's going on still. And it's like it's a moment where Will Ferrell could have just gone Will Ferrell, where it's like we've seen Will Ferrell freak out and wreck stuff so many times at this point. But when we finally, usually in that sense, it's funny because it's not exactly earned to the level that he takes it, his reaction. So it's like he's known for overreacting, and that's where a lot of the comedy comes from. But when we finally see him with a warranted reason to trash a room and just total confusion and kind of scared and all that, it somehow still works, and it maybe does still have a tinge of comedy in it. I think the other thing that stands out about this scene is I think I didn't realize it at the time, but I think this was my first time ever hearing "On the Nature of Daylight," that Max Richter piece that plays in like Arrival and Shutter Island and Disconnect and stuff like that. So that's something else, just kind of another connotation I have here. Um, but like I said, talking about the other interactions he has, like the Dustin Hoffman scenes, where Hoffman plays this really fun character where he's very no nonsense about literary things in general, but there's also these qualities to him that almost are reminiscent of Harold himself, like how observant he is and how he notices that Harold's counting everything without him being blatant about it. When he's like even just little things that I don't even know if they're supposed to be funny or not, but like the way he lists off the jobs that he has are just little moments that are really funny. Or that moment where he like goes to close the door when Harold's still standing in the doorway, and it's like it's that point where I start to wonder how many of these little quirks that Hoffman has in the movie were actually like his idea. And that's always fun where you can see like these little things that just don't feel scripted. And speaking of things that are so sort of authentic, they don't feel scripted. The characters that Calvin and Ruby are surrounded by in Ruby Sparks kind of bring out this similar vibe. But the interesting thing about Ruby Sparks, though, is that the fact that this is a character that doesn't come from reality. So when we see his relationships, like with his brother or with his mom, these are relationships that are really rooted in reality, and they're played that way, really authentically. And so what's interesting is that authenticity helps to establish the reality even more, to only further show how out of place Ruby is. Because when you look at these other relationships, like I talked about Chris Messina playing his brother, and these are scenes that are so sort of authentic they feel pretty unscripted. Like you would totally buy that Paul Dano and Chris Messina have been brothers forever when you watch them in this. And there's the relationship he has with Annette Bening, his mom, and Antonio Banderas, who is her second husband, who's not his father. So where we get this scene at Big Sur, where it's Banderas' character is extremely likable, like almost annoyingly likable. But the thing about it is, in a way, you can understand Calvin's bitterness towards him because of the whole. Not only is he, just the second husband and stuff like that, but this idea that his mom has basically changed her whole personality and changed her whole lifestyle, seemingly going along with Banderas' life. But like we were talking about, kind of like we were talking about with Gyllenhaal's character, this is a character that seems more of like she kind of found herself and kind of went in the direction that makes her happy. And so you kind of see that when you're looking at that from Calvin's perspective again. The running theme here seems to be basically women having to be the way he envisions them, where Ruby has to exist the way he's written her. Benning has to exist the way his childhood image of her that he refuses to let change. Because we also bring in his ex-girlfriend Lila, where it's like you think Lila's going to be an unseen character, and then the way he talks about their relationship and why it fell apart, and then it makes perfect sense when we realize that we eventually meet Lila, and it's like, oh yeah, there is a second side to this, and so it may just be Calvin's thing. Obviously, is Calvin's thing, is sort of trying to shape the women in his life the way he kind of wants them to be, and that's how he's gotten so fixated on Ruby and so obsessed with this idea that he's created the love of his life and made her exist, and now nothing can go wrong. But then, like I said, we get to these points where she starts to kind of become real and kind of starts to actually have her own personality and her own interests that she starts to follow. And she distances herself because Calvin isn't all that. Certainly not like he thinks he is. And he tries to play up the whole, oh, I hate the word genius, oh, don't do that. But it's like I can get, there is a certain sort of real modesty to that kind of attitude, but it's also, we kind of see as the character goes on that this is what he's striving for. This sort of admiration. And that's another thing where it's like he's constantly worried about what he looks like to everybody. That's like I said, everything he puts Scotty through. Where like Scotty is embarrassing to him because he doesn't act like this dog that attracts women and attention and admiration and all that. And it's like the more it goes on, the more pathetic Calvin's character gets. And then that kind of takes us to a dark place as we kind of get closer to our climax. But to kind of come back here to Stranger Than Fiction, as far as it going to the dark places it has to go, which it establishes very early on, the fact that Harold is basically supposed to die. The idea that, I guess you could say, as far as the ending goes, what makes it especially interesting is when we get to this point, because what's interesting about it is how much the movie has left when he finally meets Karen Eiffel for the first time, and both of them learn that he actually exists. And now Karen is stuck in this place where it's like, I have to, like, because that's the thing here, the theme with writers and all that is essentially playing God. And so it's like, yeah, I create these characters and I can do anything with them. And then it's like when we see Karen thinking about like the ramifications of that, like, if like the cruelty of it, like even if they are fictional characters, and now that she's realized one character is real and she's been writing him, she's now going through the list of like she's killed like 8 people throughout her career in books. And I love that they don't say it explicitly, but clearly the underlying question here is, were they real too? And so the idea of all of this coming around to this existential point of, does, Karen decide to play God and kill him so that she can have her masterpiece? And does Harold decide if he's going to embrace death in order to play a part in this more profound thing and give meaning to his life? Even though he's kind of already finding it in Anna a little bit, but to become this thing that could be so much more meaningful than just, like Hoffman goes through in these real... Dustin Hoffman, by the way, in the like latter part of this movie is phenomenal in how he... Like, these scenes could have really watered the movie down by spelling things out too much and spelling the themes out too much. But Hoffman especially... I mean, not to mention Farrell, but like I said, Farrell just gives a perfect performance all around. But the way Hoffman just looks at it so in matter-of-fact terms, where it's like, either you're going to die in this really profound way, or you're going to die like anybody else, and your life will have basically been, I mean, not necessarily meaningless, but there wouldn't have... It feels like it's more, as far as we as humans thinking about that existential fear of death itself and wanting to have some kind of purpose before we go. And it's like the fact that you can knowingly reach that if you do one thing that's going to prematurely end you, or you can sort of keep living and just kind of peter out in life. And it's a big fucking question. And the way this movie approaches it, what I like about it is the fact that it could seem like a cop-out how it ends. Where she does decide to let him live, and the fact that they even draw attention to the fact that the reason he survives is this very contrived thing. It's contrived in a funny sense, the way they talk about it, but at the same time it is like, when Hoffman talks about the importance of making sense in the entirety of the story, The part that the wristwatch has played throughout the entire story, like it still makes sense that the wristwatch would save him, even if it is in a contrived way. So it still comes for full circle in a certain way, but maybe not in the profound masterpiece way that it could have if they'd gone the other direction. So what you're essentially looking at, and is actually something I like about it, but I know people could also see as a cop out, is the characters are basically discussing the movie itself on top of Eiffel's story. To where it's like, this could just be, a pretty good movie, and, it's the ending that we have, and it's like, oh, if it's just a pretty good movie, that's perfectly fine. But it's like, it makes you wonder now if Eiffel's story would have been a masterpiece if he had died, how would this movie be viewed? I mean, obviously that's, the makers of the movie talking about the movie itself, but what I mean in general, maybe not masterpiece, but like, how just in general, how would this movie be viewed if it actually ended with Harold Crick dying, and would it be seen as more profound? Would it be seen as better in a way by a lot of people? But the fact that the movie's ending, basically the purpose of the movie's ending is to have that discussion, and it's like where it kind of becomes secondary what conclusion it reached, and it's just kind of about the discussion of, if you go one direction and it's just okay, is that, how does that compare to would you have done something much more profound, and the idea of just being okay with where you're at, I suppose. And I also like the way they play that up so nonchalantly when he does survive, especially with the doctor, where the doctor just describes what happened as pretty cool, and he's just very, he almost seems annoyed that this has happened, almost like maybe an audience member when they see how this is played out. Um, but yeah, I get it. And the idea of, accepting our fates, where it's like when you look at the idea of a writer having to make compromises and maybe cut stuff out or change things or whatever. Literally, the phrase for that is "kill your darlings." So the idea that the movie has kind of made that literal, and we kind of see this accepting fate both from Harold and Karen's perspectives, where it's like, making these changes that shape the whole story at the end of the day. And so how it's like like a story is made or broken by its ending. And so you could say the movie's having its cake and eating it too, but like I said, I kind of feel like it's more of the purpose of to just to discuss how these things shape stories and what, makes a story good at the end, or good versus great, at the end of the day. So that I've always honestly been perfectly fine with how this movie ended. Like to the point, I guess just because I'm too familiar with it now, but it's like I'm getting to a point now to where I can't really imagine it, as a movie that ends with Harold's death. But like I said, and the fact that we have a character like Hoffman here, he seems very bitter about the fact that the ending has changed. Like I said, there's probably going to be a lot of audience representation throughout the characters here, but kind of in this, I would say not as blatant way, but even if it is blatant, I don't think that matters because I think it's still effective. Like I said, especially like, the performances really bring that out and really make it feel like it's in a solid place that it was always meant to be as far as this movie goes, regardless of where Karen Eiffel's story was supposed to end up. Which I think is kind of profound in itself and very kind of satisfying at the end of the day. As far as Ruby Sparks' ending goes, there's a few things about it. First of all, we do get to this point where when we talk about the idea of playing God and whether it's cruel or not, what's going on here, or moral, what's going on, the idea that people have been whispering throughout the movie, like especially Chris Messina's character, where he's like, is this fucked up or is this moral? Like, is this right? And it's like we're seeing it and we're like, as an audience, we're thinking like, oh man, this is like kind of fucked up. But the movie's also entertaining and funny, so it's like kind of we're split on enjoying the movie itself and like, man, this is a wild concept, and it's like I don't know how I feel about it. And then those whispers become yelling from the rooftops when we get to this moment where he confesses that he created her and that she will do anything that he writes out. And we get this moment where we kind of come full circle where he's talking to Ruby at the beginning about naming Scotty after F. Scott Fitzgerald, and she comes to the conclusion of, oh, did you do that so you could look down on him, essentially? And so the idea that he literally makes her a dog and he just puts on this whole self-worshipping show with her, essentially, until he finally comes to the moment that he sets her free. And so that's a good culmination of everything the movie is leading up to, where it's like you kind of in the back of your mind are like, does this movie know what it is? And then it's at this point where it's like, okay, yes, this was always an underlying thing. And Calvin was always this underlying person. It's just a matter of it having to reach this sort of this explosive point in order to get to its conclusion. And so, as far as this epilogue goes, I've seen some reactions to this where a lot of people are concerned. Where the idea that after all of this, and Calvin does end up writing the book, releasing it, it becomes successful, and then he runs into Ruby, who doesn't remember him. And so the idea that they're gonna start fresh, they're gonna start from the beginning, and that can be very uneasy because we know the kind of person Calvin is, and we know the way he sees women, and how he handles what all has gone on here, and the idea, and that he's essentially used it for his success, which was the idea to begin with. So when we have this moment when it's like, oh, so we're gonna start again, and they're gonna have an actual relationship, but she's gonna be out of his power, and we're gonna see how that goes. Um, but the idea of surely this would like, first of all, does he deserve this sort of happy ending after all that? And the idea of, are we supposed to buy that after he got everything he wanted out of it, essentially he's learned a lesson, he's become a better person, he sees women in a different way? It's hard to tell because we don't really he reads an excerpt of the book, but it still feels like kind of an up in the air thing. So it tends to rub some people the wrong way. The ending of, oh, he's gonna get another chance at having a relationship with her as a real person. But I don't. I never really took it that way. I kind of took it as a bit of. I'm not even sure if I can call it a bittersweet ending. I don't think the intention is that it's ending on a high note, because it's a nice last line when she says, "Don't tell me how it ends," and he says, "I promise," and then it cuts to black. Because essentially your first thought might be, "Oh, we know the ending." Apparently, they eventually end up together because it came back around. But I would think the ending for them was the moment in the middle of the movie when she started to become her own person and started to have her own interests and wanted to have a life outside of him, and eventually seemed like she was getting tired of him, and as he says, was probably on the verge of leaving him. So that, and the fact that the only reason that's not how they ended was because he had control of her and he went back and he started tampering with it and making her more controlled. And so I would assume if we're starting fresh here, it's probably going to go the way the first half of the movie did, where they'll have a honeymoon phase, they'll be totally in love, and then she'll grow out of him just like she did before. Because, like I said, that was basically her becoming real before he, brought her back to the non-reality she comes from. So I don't think I think it's going to be kind of short-lived, and that's the cycle he's going to relive, is she's going to leave him eventually. So that's it. Or maybe he learned a lesson. I don't know. Maybe it's that simple. But that's the way I took it, was that I don't see it as much of a happy ending. So once again, you can take it forever which way you want to, much like the ending of Stranger Than Fiction. So as far as a preference between these two, I like Ruby Sparks. I like it pretty well, especially the performances and the way Kazan used the concept, and is saying these really great things and nuanced things about relationships and how people kind of view the person they're in love with and sort of start to shape a new person in their head that may not be the reality of the person, and how damaging that can be to both involved, especially the person that's sort of being shaped. And there's great characters and great performances all around. But Stranger Than Fiction, I feel like, is a bit more. I'm more moved by Stranger Than Fiction, and like because in general, like existential crisis stuff is just kind of something that as much as I hate having it, I kind of gravitate towards. And like I said, as far as the romance factor, how funny it can be, and especially the performances from people like Hoffman and Emma Thompson and stuff like that, and Farrell just doing the best thing he's ever done, and Maggie Gyllenhaal obviously being great, and it's yeah, it just kind of hits me on another level where it's like in Ruby Sparks, it's like I can acknowledge those things, and I feel like it's really got something to say, and I feel like it hits emotionally for sure. But like I said, Stranger Than Fiction just kind of hits me on kind of a higher plane. So I know one's dealing with relationships and how we see people, and the other one's dealing with literal death. But on top of romance and all that, but that's basically how I feel about these. So the next thing is going to be, I think it's another review. I think it's a review, but not for a new release, which is going to kind of lead into one of the upcoming verses that's coming. So and the rest of October stuff, the rest of September stuff, and then all the October stuff. We got a lot to go through. So until all that, I think that's it.